Right, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to plug the headset in this morning because we've got some building work going on outside, and I think the mic might be picking it up. So let's just click that in, and hopefully you can see as I just switched to the headset there. Right, welcome to another issue of Survival Skills Elevenses show. It's Wednesday, it's the 1st of July. It seems like I've been doing this forever already. But anyway, here we are with today's show. What have we got for you? Well, bit of news on the MOT extension, which is coming to an end directly. The e-scooter trial has actually been approved now, so we have a time frame for these things to appear on the road. Harley are developing a little 300cc motorcycle in China. I'll be interested to see your views on that. The ZX25R, lovely little 4-cylinder bike, which personally appeals to me. The Kiwis are going to get it, lucky beggars, at a price. So KTM are filling the gap between the 390 and the 800 range with a 500 twin. MAG is demanding government action, and I'm going to be asking why we don't get simulator training for riders later on in the show. So make a brew, grab a biscuit, pull up a chair, and you can join me for the next 30 minutes of topical news, controversial views, and better biking tips. Don't forget, if you miss the show live, you can catch up over on YouTube or here on Facebook. Right, okay, so on with the show. Let's just kill the banner. Oh yes, and one other thing, don't forget, if you have a question, a comment, feedback of any sort, anything to say at all, drop it off in the comment stream and I will get back to you at the end of the show. All right, so MOTs, what's going on with the MOTs? We probably recall that as of the 1st of April, MOTs were being extended for 6 months, and the idea of that was to relieve pressure on MOT stations as people stayed home from work, but also to make sure that those people who still were working were actually able to test the vehicles of key workers. But with the easing of lockdown, many vehicles have returned to the road. MOT stations are now mostly open, and basically MOTs are being reintroduced as of the 1st of August for England, Scotland and Wales. Now, what that means is that if your MOT happens to expire between the 1st of April and the 31st of July, you will still be granted that 6-month extension. That happens to apply to one of my bikes, incidentally. So you've still got the 6 months if you happen to fall into that April to July period. But if your MOT expires on August the 1st or afterwards, then you're back to the 12-month normal MOT. You must present your vehicle in a normal way. Why is this being done? Well, the one reason is that there are growing concerns about road safety, and that's based on a statistic that suggests that 1 in 3 vehicles actually fails the test when it's presented. AA President Edmund King, for example, said that it makes sense to reintroduce MOT testing from the 1st of August now that COVID-19 restrictions are being lifted and all garages and dealerships are open. The government has similarly urged that drivers who actually do get the extension make sure that their cars are roadworthy and properly maintained. And Roads Minister Baroness Veer said, as people return to our roads, it's vital that motorists are able to keep their vehicles safe. That's why restrictions are easing. MOT testing will again become mandatory. And she also went on to urge people whose MOT would have normally expired to actually go and get a test. If you're shielding, then many garages are arranging a collection and delivery service. What's not quite so clear, though, is what happens if lockdown is reapplied. Now, as you probably have picked up, that's happened in Leicester. So now, if your MOT expires in Leicester in the next month and you're still locked down, who knows what the answer to that is. And as I said, this is England, Wales and Scotland, and it doesn't apply to Northern Ireland. You have a 1-year extension over there, and that still applies. Okay, coming soon, we're going to look at the e-scooter trial. Harley's building a baby 338 in China. We'll talk about KTM briefly and their new 500 twin plans. MAG is demanding government action, and we'll talk about simulator training for motorcycles too. Don't forget, you are watching Kevin Williams here with Elevenses from Survival Skills, and I'll be bringing you this show on Wednesdays and Sundays. Okay. Love them or hate them, many of us will be showing the road with e-scooters very soon indeed. Yesterday, Britain gave the green light to the accelerated and expanded trial of rented e-scooters that I've been talking about over the last few weeks. And as I also said, the programme's been brought forward and expanded to ease pressure on public transport and help people return to work, whilst in theory maintaining social distancing. Now, these new regulations will actually take effect from Saturday, and the government wants the trials to run in a number of towns and cities, and they want them to start at the end of August, by the end of August, and to run for 12 months. And Transport Minister Rachel Maclean said in a statement, e-scooters may offer the potential for convenient, clean and cost-effective travel that may help ease the burden on the transport network, etc., etc. And the trials, she says, are intended to test whether these do these things. But it won't be a free-for-all. Now, as I said before, private scooters are still banned under these trials. The only scooters that will be available will be ones from hire companies who will provide insurance. Now, what's been clarified is that riders will have to hold a valid driver's license, and they must be at least 16. Now, it doesn't entirely make it clear whether that includes a provisional license, because obviously you could have a valid provisional license with a CBT for a motorcycle, but whether that entitles you to ride one of these scooters, I cannot yet tell you. A week ago, I noted that the proposed top speed was 12.5 miles per hour, and I pointed out that that's slower than the electrically assisted e-bikes. And I suggested this would cause problems with a two-speed issue in cycle lanes, and it would also be out of line with Euro scooters. And so this appears to have been addressed by revising the speed upwards to 15.5 miles per hour, which is 25 kph, and that's a fairly standard speed that's already been adopted. Now, in terms of who's going to run the trial, two names have come forward. The first is a German scooter company called TIER Mobility, and the second is a Swedish startup called VOR. I don't know whether that's pronounced VOI, but they already operate in 10 European countries. VOI expect a huge demand for these scooters for short journeys. And what they said via their UK General Manager, Richard Corbett, is we've seen an explosion of demand in all our cities across Europe. And the number of rides, he says, has doubled compared with before the pandemic. And he concludes that's being driven by people who are scared to use public transport, and they see this as a viable alternative. And just how seriously the trial here in the UK is being taken is indicated by a bit of news my buddy Malk sent me. TIER have actually poached the general manager of Uber, a chap called Fred Jones, to run their UK division. Jones had only been in the general manager position for 5 months, although he has actually worked for Uber for 5 years. And he basically says, we're very much at the dawn of a new era, and I believe the introduction of e-scooters will have a profoundly positive impact on our towns and cities for decades to come. I'm very excited to join TIER, etc., etc. But to my mind, the biggest problem with these things still remains their the idea that they are picked up from a bank of these scooters and delivered back to a collection area. And that means there's a sort of a limit to where you can actually use them. Now, the key point of car ownership, private vehicle ownership, is it's door to door, door to destination. You don't have to go out of your way to find your car. It's parked generally either on the drive or outside the house. Even the Zip cars address this. I can walk to a Zip car parking bay from my location here in London in less than 5 minutes, and I can get either a car or a van. And I'm hardly in central London. I'm 6 miles out. So unless these scooters are actually widely distributed about cities in the suburbs, it's hard to see how they can be used for anything other than end of journey, the so-called final mile solution, which you have to take public transport to achieve in the first place. It's all very well positioning them around the West End and the City of London, but you have to get to the West End and the City of London first, which means either driving or using public transport. So I kind of question how good they're going to be in a really big city like London. They may well work very effectively in a smaller city, and they may work very well in a place like off the top of my head, Los Angeles, which is a sprawling place with lots of little centres where people work fairly close to home. Not that many people travel right into downtown LA. This is a parking issue too. The rental bikes and already become a pain in the neck when they get abandoned on pavements, and adding e-scooters into the mix isn't going to endear them to pedestrians. And put that all together, and you kind of have to ask how this is going to impact on the use of illegal privately owned scooters, because they still are banned. As I said, they become a common sight in the UK, and I suspect existing owners, some of whom have spent a fair amount of money, will be very unhappy about having to dump their rather costly piece of kit and then swap away to a rented scooter that they can't even get to without undertaking a journey to get there. I suspect eventually they'll have to legalise private e-scooters, but probably they'll be regulated. And one final point, you don't have to wear a helmet to use these things, but they will be recommended. Okay, so you're watching Kevin Williams, like I said, with the Elevenses show. Don't forget, if you want something to read, you can always head over to my Spotlight page on my publisher's site at Lulu, and you can find my range of books over there. I'm going to be talking about KTM and their middling-sized bike, MAG, and why they're demanding government action. And I'm going to finish off with an item about the possibility of simulator training for riders at some point in the future. Right, okay, but first we'll have a look at the baby Harley. Now, word's been leaked that Jiang Motor, who are a Chinese bike manufacturer and probably better known over here in the UK and in the West generally for being the company that owns the former Italian marque Benelli and badges up and sells motorcycles that they build under the Benelli name. Well, they're now in partnership to build what's been reported as a 338cc machine for Harley Davidson, and according to these reports, the bike is going into production any time about now. Harley Davidson announced a growth strategy which they called More Roads to Harley Davidson back in 2017, and the thrust of this new strategy was to shift the production line towards smaller bikes, which will specifically be built for the Asian market. And the suggestions are that this machine will have a parallel twin engine, putting out about 36 horsepower. And this partnership came about in December 2019, so it's all been fairly quick fire. And, love it or hate it, what this actually shows us is that Chinese bike manufacturers really are here to stay, when the likes of Harley are actually looking at a Chinese manufacturer to develop their machine. With all their heritage and all their skills, they are offloading the production and development of these small bikes to a Chinese manufacturer. So I think, really, it's time we started taking their products seriously. We're very often very scathing about the output from Chinese companies, but WK have certainly produced some competent looking bikes, and it'd be interesting to see how this Harley shapes up and also where it appears. It may well be Asian market only for the moment, but if there's a demand, it could appear in Europe too. Similarly, on another note of a small motorcycle, which has been developed mostly with the Far East market in mind, Kawasaki built a 4-cylinder ZX25R. It's a gorgeous looking little machine, and there have been various teaser videos of it online. As you might expect from a 250 4-cylinder, it's a bit of a rev monster. It's producing something like about 48 horsepower, according to some reports, which should give it a top speed somewhere around about 110, 115 miles per hour, maybe a little bit more, as it's got a slippery full fairing. And the lucky people in New Zealand, you will be getting this bike. You won't find it on showroom floors, apparently, but it will be available to order to be delivered specially. The bad news is that it will be somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 UK pounds. So it's a fairly premium price for a small CC motorcycle. But having ridden a 254 many years ago, one of the older Kawasaki's, they are a bit of a hoot to ride, I can tell you. Okay, so just remind yourselves that you can catch up with this show Elevenses on Wednesdays and Sundays at 11, and you can catch up here if you didn't catch it live on Facebook, or you can head over to my YouTube channel, which is Survival Skills UK. Don't forget that all important UK on the end. Right, okay, what's happening at KTM? A lot of bike news come out in the last couple of days. Well, their boss, Stefan Pera, has confirmed that KTM is actually working on a range of 500cc bikes, a naked and an adventure bike for sure, and they are set for a release somewhere between 2021 and 2022. He's apparently working on this bike, or KTM rather, are working on this bike with their production partner Bajaj, who you may know are Indian, and the project will go ahead at the Pune Research and Development Centre, but the engineering side of it is going to be taken care of by KTM's own team. They'll look after basically the design and development and testing of the bike before it goes out to India to be finalised and built. It's going to be a 500cc liquid-cooled parallel twin. And that'll pop into the lineup next to the 790 and the 890 and just above the 390 single. It's likely that the machine will come out in wrapped around different frames, and the likelihood is that they'll continue their naked and adventure bike and probably a sports bike version too, I would guess. It's likely to push out about 60 horsepower, so that should be good for 120 miles an hour or thereabouts, and it could be quite an exciting little bike. KTM usually do something a little bit different with their bikes to the Japanese manufacturers. It would also have to have a new frame, it seems, because neither of the existing frames is likely to fit. So, yeah, where will that bike sit? Well, it's a little bit too big for the A2 license, so maybe there'll be a restricted engine performance version to go with that too. Okay, so two items I want to finish off with. I'm going to be looking at the pros and cons of simulators in motorcycle training and ask basically why we haven't got any at the moment. But one point from MAG has popped up. The Motorcycle Action Group are ramping up pressure, according to themselves, to consider its 3 demands campaign. And basically, MAG have written to MPs to point out that funds are spent for the benefit of all. And they contacted Grant Shapps, and their 3 demands are to recognise and encourage the role of motorcycles and scooters as socially distanced, congestion busting, sustainable transport, etc., etc. To mandate all authorities to immediately allow motorcycle and scooter access in bus and cycle lanes, and to mandate immediately for local authorities to provide emergency secure parking facilities to be used by motorcyclists and cyclists. Now, you may remember that, in fact, I proposed those some months ago, so it's good to see that we're all thinking along the same lines. However, I'm never entirely sure that making demands is actually the right way to go about this kind of thing. Despite calling for immediate action last week, there's been no response from Grant Shapps or the Department of Transport, and I kind of suspect that there might be a connection there. But Mags say they wrote to Mr. Shapps with 3 perfectly reasonable demands. Well, maybe if they'd have made them suggestions and that they had made the same point that they don't require any additional funding. Not entirely sure about that. You have to change signs. You have to provide those secure parking places. That is going to cost money, so I'm not entirely sure about the logic of that statement. It's not the work of a few moments either. It does require some fairly significant changes. You have to identify where those bikes can be parked, for example. It's all very well to say open up cycle parking areas to motorcycles, but if there's more cycles around, you need more space, and that somebody needs to think about that. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed message, and I think it's a bit of an inaccurate statement as well. That MAG really should go back and reconsider and think again about A, how they phrase it, and B, what they're actually asking for. I honestly think that the phraseology is not conducive to a sensible debate on this. Right, anyway, enough about that. Final point today, simulators and motorcycle training. Now, this is something that has cropped up a number of times over the years whilst I've been involved in motorcycle training. There was many years ago when I kind of was a nice green and inexperienced rider trainer. I took a motorcycle instructor training course with a company called CSM, who probably some of you will remember, and some of you, if you're newer viewers, probably won't. CSM basically dominated the rider training market through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. At one point, they had around about 90 training schools scattered up and down England and Scotland, and they eventually retrenched to about 50. But they were still far and away the biggest training school in the UK, and they actually set the scene for a lot of bike training that's still done in the UK. There is, sort of a kind of racial memory, as it were, where trainers who trained with CSM back in the late 80s through the 90s and so on went on to set up their own training schools, and they then trained instructors themselves using the same techniques, the same skills that they had learned from CSM. And you can still see that even now. I can still go out and watch a rider, sometimes out with an instructor, and I can see the CSM influence that's carried on down the line. So, even almost 20 years after they folded, there is still that influence that CSM had. Anyway, one of the things that CSM had was a rolling road, and they'd given one of these to each school. And the idea was that you strapped a CG125 to it, and it was an easy way to teach people how to use the clutch and the throttle and the brakes. The gadget never really caught on for some reason. When I went there, it was shoved in the back of the lockup, unloved and unused. And I did ask, why don't you use it? It'd be far easier to see people. Too much trouble. We have to get it out. We have to set it up. It takes time. Okay, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? With a mechanical device, you actually have to find the time and space to set it up. But computers are something completely different. We've actually all got computers. We've got a phone. So I wonder why it is that we don't have the ability to deliver some of our training via a simple PC web-based or even a phone-based simulator. The sort of thing that I'm looking at really is the kind of work that's gone into something called sports psychology. Now, I talked about sports psychology quite a lot on my own training courses and in my writing. Now, you may be wondering what the connection between motorcycle riding and sports actually is here, but it's the need to develop a kind of mental toughness to cope with situations which are outside of the normal. Now, in sport, the earliest use of sports psychology that I can see lies in golf and tennis, but it's in almost universal use. So it is an accepted science in its own right, and it's accepted as a very practical way of preparing to play sport. Golf and tennis are two good examples, and that's where I saw it first. If you think about those sports, they both happen, they're basically spectator-free sports. You do most of your playing with a couple of other people, maybe 3 other people if you're playing golf, maybe 3 other people if you're playing doubles tennis. But they're not really spectators, they're competitors. Hardly anybody goes to watch a game of golf unless you're playing in a tournament. And now, suddenly, you can qualify for a fairly big tournament. People qualify for the Open or Wimbledon. Suddenly, they're playing in front of a big crowd, something they've never experienced before. And what happens then is that many talented sportsmen and women, they simply choke under the pressure. It's a pressure cooker environment. They have a game plan, and under pressure, they simply fail to follow it. Now, short of playing practice tournaments in front of a big crowd, to get them practiced in front of playing in front of a big crowd, the only effective solution is to simulate the situation. Now, visualization is the technique that is used in sports psychology. The idea is that you simply use your own built-in simulator, your brain, your mind, and you sit down and you imagine you are playing your final hole or your final set or whatever in your own mind, and you play out a winning scenario. And that's how you prepare to deal with a situation that you cannot actually experience until it happens. And that's where the crossover into rider training comes, because if you think about it, the emergencies that we experience on bikes genuinely don't happen very often. And again, mostly, more to the point, they're not possible to prepare for. It's all very well to get people going up and down the training ground doing emergency stop practice, and they can get very good at doing emergency stop practice in the training ground. But short of pushing a rubber car out from behind a building and seeing how they cope, we have no idea how that rider will actually use the skills that they've learned in the car park in a real life emergency. So the trouble is that first time a real threat develops on the road, we have to recognize the issue that we're seeing developing in front of us and then deal with it with absolutely no prior experience of that threat. And the trouble with that learn by experience approach is that we actually have to survive the experience. If we lose a tennis match because we double fault in the final set, or if we miss the winning putt on the 18th green because we've stiffened up, it may be a career-defining moment. And there are plenty of players who have had that kind of big failure on the big stage and never come back from it. But it's not a life-ending moment, which is potentially the case on a motorcycle. So we have this issue on 2 wheels that we may know what we were supposed to do, but when it mattered most, we just couldn't do it. Now, airline accident studies have found that almost exactly the same problem confronts pilots in mid-emergency. And so what they've done there is that they have adopted simulators. And the other thing that the training in those simulators has done is it's moved away from the idea that if we perform perfectly, nothing can go wrong, ideally avoiding getting into trouble in the first place. And that is obviously still the primary goal. Of course, we want to fly the plane or ride the bike well enough to avoid getting into trouble. But the simulator training takes them into those unexpected emergencies. And that's what the simulator allows. It gives the pilot an opportunity to experience those real life emergencies that are actually hard to experience in real life, but in that simulator, say engine failure on takeoff. The pilot has to know how to deal with that. And the way to do that is to simulate it and give them that experience before they're flying a real plane and the engine fails for the first time. So the simulator simply moves the visualization where we use our imagination to a external device, which basically allows somebody else's imagination or their experience to throw an unexpected scenario our way. Now, as I said, an engine failure on takeoff isn't something most pilots are likely to experience all that often, I hope, but it's easily programmed into a simulator, and then the flight crew can work through the necessary steps, which first of all recognize it's happening, secondly, retain control of the plane in the immediate moments, and then come up with a strategy to land it safely. And you think about that, there's nothing fundamentally different from taking a rider down the busy high street where a car turns into their path. We have to recognize that that situation is developing. We need to retain control as we begin to take some evasive action, and we have to navigate away safely around the hazard, whether that's stopping or swerving or anything else. So how effective is a simulator? Well, there are plenty of studies on their effectiveness. People who use high fidelity simulators can show that the subject's physiological and psychological sensations, shock, confusion, fear, are almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Heart rate goes through the roof, people start sweating, all the signs that they're under stress. And the results are there to be seen. Pilots regularly now deal with in-flight emergencies that have caused crashes in the past. So, yeah, one skeptic that I was talking to recently on this topic said that you need that heart in the mouth fear sensation to actually hammer it home to you. And he wondered how you can practice for this in real life. Well, in fact, actually, if we've got to the fear stage, it's an indication that things have already gone wrong in a big, big way. And fear isn't a trigger for learning. Fear is a trigger for actually not taking the course which leads to that situation by actually not doing it at all. If we scare the shit out of ourselves doing something, we tend to look for other ways of achieving the same goal, not better ways of getting around the problem. So typical sort of thing here is that somebody has a fright on the motorway and therefore they will not use motorways. There are any number of riders and drivers who avoid motorways. I had somebody out on a course not so long ago who avoided country lanes because they had a crash on a corner on a country lane. So they only ever took wide sweeping A roads, and anything that took them out of their comfort zone they couldn't deal with. So we have to understand that fear is actually an unwanted product. It's not something that actually helps at all. So what actually goes wrong when things turn out to be developing in a way we weren't anticipating? Well, as I said many times in my writing, the first thing that happens is surprise. Surprise that what we're seeing in front of us isn't what we expected to see in front of us. And then that generates a confusion because we are now struggling to recognize what's happening and come up with a strategy to deal with something that we're not even sure what's going on all at the same time. The delay that takes is significant. It can be 2 or 3 seconds before we even recognize that we have to brake in an emergency. And then the body's own built-in responses to personal harm kick in, and that's the fear side of things. And fear is paralyzing, and it's the trigger for what Keith Code, the American rider coach, called survival reactions. Again, something else I've talked about in the past. Inappropriate responses, freezing are being 2 examples. The problem is that surprise is the trigger. Once you experience that gut-wrenching fear of personal harm, we're not going to respond as we want to. So it's already too late. And that means that a significant number of motorcycle crashes are actually avoidable, even in circumstances where the rider knew what they should be doing and that they were capable of doing it. So the answer is to try to remove the element of surprise, and that is where a simulator comes in, because a simulator can expose new riders to situations that are impossible to train for in any other way, the rubber car that I mentioned earlier. And if they don't deal with it, well, they're not dead. We can then repeat the event and coach them through the correct responses until they can perform those correct responses automatically. And this is how we get the training to stick to deal with a hazard in real life. We simulate it. And that's exactly what pilot training does. It allows the pilot to experience the unexpected in a safe environment where they can learn to detect the warning signs and to interpret what's happening and then replay their training to deal with that emergency. It doesn't remove the stress when things goes wrong. Any of this training doesn't remove that stress, but it does take out the surprise element. It takes away the what's it doing now issue that the airline pilots have sometimes when things start to go wrong. So defeating surprise by making an emergency a known quantity would be a huge step forward for driver and rider safety. And the other thing that simulators can do is shock experienced riders out of their complacency, because experienced riders still have the old-fashioned standard crashes. There's no evidence really that experienced riders avoid making the same rookie mistakes that new riders do. They just don't do it quite so often. And that's the reason that, again, experienced pilots will undergo simulator refresher training. But as long as we all pretend that the only way to train people is to train them in perfect performance in the hope that they will never make a mistake, we are fallible human beings. We always make mistakes, and we will continue to be unable to deal with ones that are in fact perfectly survivable if only we had a prediction strategy and ready to deal with that hazard. So, okay, in my opinion, we have to supply trainees with a better preparation for hazards on the road. And I honestly do see a real role for simulators. And probably what I'll come back to next week, because I'm running a bit short of time, is how we might actually use those with the technology that we've got already right in front of us. Right, okay, so that's enough for today from me. We've been online for 37 minutes or thereabout. So don't forget, if you have enjoyed today's show, you can support me over at the coffee.com survival skills site. £3 donation over there not only helps support me through what is still a pretty difficult time. I'm still rebuilding after the shutdown, but it also gives you access to 30 days to a wealth of articles I've previously written on Facebook. I'm putting more and more up every day. And if you become a supporter, a subscriber rather, with a £3 monthly subscription, then you will also open up other content, including access to parts of my Performance Bends course. So, right, once again, you've been watching Kevin Williams with Elevenses today. I'll be back on Sunday at 11, and I hope to see you then. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you didn't hear too much noise from outside. So over to, wait till next Sunday and see you again. All right, bye for now.